Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session, Leaders as Key Communicators, telling stories that encourage others to listen. Your presenter today is Kitty Watson. Kitty is the president and founder of Intellect Incorporated, a global leadership and organization development firm that focuses on bettering the world by growing leaders who drive inclusion, enterprise agility, productivity, and engagement. Former department chair at Tulane University, she is the author of 15 books and a top 25 most prolific women writers in communication. Her book, Listen Up, is published in 8 languages and featured on ABC's 2020. Her research is published in the Harvard Business Review, People Plus Strategy, SHRM, and Chief Learning Officer, to name a few. Committed to paying it forward, she is an advocate for social justice and sponsor of a 2019 CEO Habitat for Humanity build and funding to support victims of human trafficking. Ladies and gentlemen, Kitty Watson.
Thank you, Cheryl. It is a pleasure to be here today with you and to talk about something that is one of my favorite topics, and that is how we can be key communicators. I want you to think for a moment that it's a year from now, and you're sitting with your colleagues, we hope back in our offices or at least working remotely when we can go back and forth, and think about what stories you might tell about 2020. How were you impacted? What lessons learned did you have? What stories might you tell your grandchildren in 20 years from now about what it was like to live through the pandemic? All of the stories and the ways that we communicate in our lives influences how we're perceived as leaders. And in fact, if we look at some of the research that's done from Ketchum Communication, for example, they will say that 50% of a leader's overall effectiveness is tied to how they're perceived as communicators and listeners. And most recently, a study was done by Leadership IQ that talked about 29% of employees say that their leaders don't respond with or respond with defensiveness, blame, and shame when they bring up sensitive issues like we've seen in 2020 with discrimination, with race relations, or gender issues. Communication is important, and I'd like you to take a moment. And in the chat, if you would think about the best communicator in your organizations, identify what his or her characteristics are. What are their traits? What are the things that they do especially well? And I'm going to be looking for some of the things that you might say. Some of you, I'm sure I'm seeing now, are saying things like they're authentic, that they're organized, they're knowledgeable, they're compassionate, and the list goes on. I hope that at least some of you said that they tell good stories, because stories do make a difference. And today we're going to have 3 key messages that are going to come out of what I'm talking about. One is that storytelling is a key communication and communicator asset. If we have a storytelling ability, it's going to make us more effective. Number 2, stories enhance your overall effectiveness as a leader. And 3, listeners play a critical role during storytelling. And so we're going to look at those 3 things and see how we might enhance our effectiveness as storytellers. Let's first look at storytelling is a key communicator asset. If we can tell stories and do it effectively, we can capture the imagination and build relationships in a unique way. In fact, stories build relationships, and I'm going to go in 3 ways. Recent research with brain and neural activity says that when we tell a story, the other person that is engaged, their brain lights up in the same areas of our brain as we tell the story. So it's almost as though we're modeling together. We want our brains to be active, involved, and engaged when we're listening to others. In addition, if we think back to one of the world's best storytellers of capturing our imagination of what could happen in the future, it was probably Steve Jobs. And even though he's not with us any longer, there were 2 things that he did that made him so effective. One was he planned, and the second is that he created actually storyboards. He knew when he was going to tell a story, he knew the impact that he wanted it to have, and he drove his teams crazy in trying to make sure that it was perfection. Finally, I want you to think about TED Talks. And the top rated TED Talks, ones that we've listened to, learned from, and enjoyed, all use stories to capture our imaginations. So if we want to be the kind of communicator that other people want to listen to, the use of story is going to make a difference. So stories do enhance our effectiveness, and this is our second key message. And there's power in story. I'm sharing a personal photograph here of my son-in-law with two of my grandchildren. And we started, many of us, with stories from our parents. And in fact, those of you that have children or grandchildren know that often when we tell a story about their parents, they want to have us tell it over and over again. It's only when we know another person's story, in fact, that we think we know them. And that deepens the relationship and allows us to trust, build those relationships, will allow us to be open, give ideas, and do the things that will help our organizations be more effective. My belief is that all of us have a story worth telling, and in fact, many of them. And those stories, what we remember most is how they make us feel. And so the story can engage us in a way that frightens us. A story can give us a warning of what not to do. Stories can also inspire us to do things, to take risks, to do things that we might not have ever dreamed about doing previously. And what I love about stories, particularly in organizations, is that we advance often in an organization because someone tells a story about us. Most of our clients come from stories other clients have told. And the same is true with when we're working with someone in an organization and they're promoted. It's often their peers that tell the stories of how they work together, what they're like to their bosses and their managers that help them be effective. So when people remember your story and they retell it, you have the most potent form of social media working for you. We all think about social media in so many ways today, but I want you to think about that. The story, the power of story to capture imagination and attention and for people to repeat it. There are three types of stories that make a difference. And I want to go over each of these briefly and then give you an example of some of those stories. Though the first I call leadership stories. And think about in 2020, with all the racial unrest and some things that happen, and we know a trial is starting this week, or in the week with about George Floyd and his killing. Many CEOs and leaders in organizations began to tell stories or to have their leaders tell stories of incidents of how they were impacted or affected. One story that really got me is that I wrote to my friends of color after George Floyd was killed and expressed my sadness about that and disappointment for the world we were living in. One person wrote back and thanked me. I mean, everybody wrote back, but one person in particular said that I was the only white person that had reached out to her to express my feelings. And that story got me and actually encouraged us to go into a whole new direction of some of the things that we were doing in the company. Leadership stories help to recognize what other people are doing. They train other people, they inspire other people. Those are leadership stories. There are also transition stories. And in 2020, we also had a bunch of transition stories. Can you remember the date that things changed for you in March of 2020? When you got the notice that everyone was going to be working remotely. Or I remember being in Washington, D.C., and all of a sudden my phone was lighting up and I got calls saying that 4 conferences had been canceled or postponed on March 6th when I was in D.C. They're transition stories about what's changing, what's going to be different, or a new position or role. All of those are transition stories. And then finally, there are these special occasion stories that we need to be able to tell. Several years ago, I was attending a conference And what I was most impressed by was not the speaker himself, but I was inspired by the person that introduced the speaker. This speaker, the person that introduced the speaker, did something really different. Instead of just reading all the information in the bio, they told a story. They had called the wife of the presenter and asked what was important to this speaker. What motivated him to get up every day? Why did he do what he did? And she started telling these stories that the wife had told. It made it much more personal and engaging. And it reminded me of how everyone has a story that we can tell and tell differently. As you look at the next slide, most people will recognize Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers. There have been movies and documentaries about him and the impact he had on the world. He was really telling a lot of stories about values, what was important, how to treat each other, will you be my neighbor, those kinds of things. And he dealt with some issues of inclusion and sensitivity way before people in other areas in corporate worlds were even thinking about it. Let's look at this next slide and this picture. Think about what it tells us. This was in 1969. And Officer Clemens was a regular on the show. And Mr. Rogers wanted to demonstrate how we are all the same. He got Officer Clemens, even with some resistance from him, to have this one picture of swimming and putting feet in the water together and the safety of that. Pictures with stories can make a major impression on how we interact and what we do with other people. Think of the powerful stories that your parents told you, for example, or your grandparents, or leaders in your organization that have inspired you in some way. Many of them have a picture that tells a story to go along with it. So, my belief is that leadership is really all about having your own story, being authentic, being able to share it. But the thing is that we need to know how to tell stories and when to tell them. If we haven't really thought about it, we might tell a story, but it may not have the impact that it could have. And so we're going to look at 5 different types of stories that I believe all leaders need to be able to tell. And I'm going to use particular leaders to demonstrate what these stories are and how they can be used. So if you're going to be getting, a handout with all this information, with also other resources, so don't feel nervous about that or capturing it, because you'll have this information. The first type of story is who am I? Who am I story. Think about when a new leader comes to an organization and people aren't sure about their new boss. They're wondering about who he or she is. And it's really interesting to me as I've thought about, some of you may have recognized his picture immediately, Brian Chesky. He's the CEO of Airbnb. And he started one of his presentations with what started him thinking about travel and vacations. And as a child, his parents said, we're going to go on our first vacation. They said, where do you want to go? And he thought about it for a minute and he said, the North Pole. Well, they didn't take him to the North Pole. And actually they took him somewhere where he really didn't want to go. But eventually they took him to North Pole, New York, and he could be there for that. But that started him on a journey of imagination and travel. And he told that story to let people know what he's about and how much he enjoys and wants other people to enjoy travel. The second story that a leader needs to be able to tell is, why am I here? What is it that makes a difference in my life? Or why do I want to be in this organization at this time? Or why do I want to give this presentation today for you? And for me, for example, it's because stories kind of changed my life. When I was an undergraduate, I took a course in public speaking and was reinforced and got an award because of the stories that I told about my family and particularly my dad dating. And so I would get people with humor and they like that. But I think about someone like Elon Musk. And we know him for a variety of reasons. I mean, Tesla, of course, and the SpaceX and all the things that he does. But sometimes we might forget why he is where he is. And what he would say, and he would show pictures and demonstrate that, is because he dreams of and wants to make sure the world reduces its carbon footprint. He wants it to be zero. And so he is here working on things that are going to make a difference for our environment. And that's what his passion is. And that's why he's here. The third person that I want to highlight today is Tony Hesh. And unfortunately, in 2020, we lost him as a leader. And he was an interesting person in that he had started out with businesses, and when they weren't fun anymore, he sold them. And he actually was a venture capitalist, and he discovered Zappos, and he really liked the model. But what he wanted and his vision for Zappos was that it would have the best customer experience and that people would treat each other with respect. Some of you may know this story, but if you were to interview and be considered for an executive position at Zappos, you would fly into, back then, to Las Vegas, and a driver would pick you up at the airport. That driver was trained to observe how he or she was treated. If that potential candidate started a conversation, engaged with them, asked questions, and treated them really well, then the driver took them to headquarters, let them out, and they had their interview. If, however, that same driver experienced a person that didn't treat them with respect, was rude, treated them as though they weren't very valuable, then the driver was instructed to take them right back to the airport and not finish the interview. That was how important it was for Tony Hesh to create the kind of environment that was a great customer and employee experience. Now, you may not recognize this person as much, but Patty McCord was a former chief talent officer at Netflix. And particularly today and in 2020, we hear a lot about the different programmings that are offered on Netflix. And she's no longer there, but she has written a book on the lessons learned in 2020 that we can take forward. And she also wrote a number of articles about what we can learn about Netflix and its success and what people thought wouldn't happen that did. There's so many lessons learned. I know I mentor a number of women, and I tell a story about a mistake that I made when I was chair of the department at Tulane. Our department, I helped to create it, and I was the youngest chair, and I was actually a chair of the department before I was tenured because of a variety of circumstances. And I realized that our faculty were underpaid comparatively to the other departments. And so I put a whole business case together and went and fought for our faculty to get more pay. Fortunately, I was listened to, and that happened. Unfortunately, I didn't ask for that same recognition for myself, and I wasn't given it. A lesson I learned is that you have to ask for yourself as well as others. And I can pass that along, that we need to ask for what we want. We may be told no, but it's still very important. The final person that I'm sure you recognize by our picture is Oprah Winfrey. And in addition to all the different things that she's done and visibility that she's had, what makes her stand out are what I call projection stories. And projection stories are ones that allow a person to kind of know what you're thinking, or you try to think about what they are thinking. You empathize with your audience or your listener in such a way that you relate to them. And one of the things that she does so well is to what I call listen stories out of other people. Because of the way she sets up the environment, the psychological safety that she provides, she gets other people to express what's going on inside of them. And with our own situations, when we're telling a projection story, we might say, for example, some of you may be already going back to offices or have a plan for that. And if I were the manager, I might say, I know a number of you are having some anxiety about going back to the office. Some of you have children and you're still not sure about what the school situation is. Some of you haven't gotten your shots yet and you're wondering about what that means. So today, and then we would go on. And so you're relating to them in such a way that allows you to know that you know their story and you're empathizing with them. So if we can think about 5 stories, these 5 stories and others, we can begin to make a list. I'm hoping that as I tell stories and as you see these, that you're making a note for yourself about the kind of stories that you might be able to tell, or ones that you remember from a leader or from a family member that you want to tell someone else. Begin to capture those kinds of stories, your own or others, that you can use when you're working with people to engage them in a different way. Many people say, okay, so we have these 5 stories that we could tell, but how do we build it? How do we create a story that we want to tell? And so if you would for a moment, just think about, and you could even put it in the chat if you want, a future opportunity where you might use a story. And we talked about 3 types. They're leadership stories like values and what's going on in the organization. They're transition stories about changes or big announcements that may be happening. And then there are those special occasion stories. So if you have a wedding coming up and you're going to make a toast, this would be a different kind of story that you might be able to tell. So there are 5 questions that I suggest you ask yourself before telling a story or creating it. And that is, first of all, how will I gain interest? Why will people be interested? How do I relate it to what I'm talking about in the moment? And you notice that with some of the examples that I gave and some of the stories that I told, it was related to an idea to reinforce it, to help you understand how that might work. The second question is, what impact do you want to have with this story? What do you want people do you want them to remember it for, to change a behavior, to do something differently? I told the story about the woman I reached out to that hadn't been reached out to get us to think about who else can we reach out to that maybe needs to feel as though other people care about how they're being treated. Number 3, what do you want the listener to remember or do? Is there an action you want them to take? Do you want to inspire them to go volunteer? Do you want to inspire them to go take a course so that they could be better prepared for the next promotion? You can do all of these things by telling stories. For example, I might tell the story of a leader that took a course and something that was very unrelated to his discipline, but it allowed him to see the world differently. Or a woman that I had worked with at Pfizer years ago that took a special fellowship in Uganda. And what she was able to do was to work at an orphanage. She was a physician, but she brought back ideas to Pfizer that helped them actually create new vaccines, not the one we're using today, but also new products and services to help the underserved. So then think about, how do I introduce a story? How do I tell it? And how do I end it? What's the lesson learned, or how do I want people to act? And finally, if we can, we need to tell our stories in 1 minute or less. Because of sound bites today and how quickly we listen, we get pretty bored if someone goes on and on with a story and doesn't get to the punchline. I'm reminded of one of my favorite authors about storytelling, and it's Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell wrote several books, of course. He's a mythologist. And one of them was that a leader has 1,000 faces. And he talked about the hero's adventure. And I'm going to reinforce this again in a few minutes. But he had 4 elements of the hero's adventure and the story that can be told. He said, first of all, a hero, and I'm going to say you as a leader, you're prepared for the adventure. You've had the education, you've had the experience. And so now you need to take some risk. What are the stories that you could tell? How could you experiment with this and take some risk? Follow your heart. That's what another leader does. They begin to think about something that matters to them that they want to tell a story about. And finally, the story brings back something of value. It does something to change another person. So you're prepared, you're willing to take risk, You follow your heart and you bring back something of value. That's what a story does. It captures the imagination. So now let's think about, we have just been talking about what we do as a speaker. We become an advocate, and our society really has trained us to be speakers, to talk to others, to share ideas. But the key message number 3 is that listeners play a critical role during storytelling, and very critical. In fact, sometimes we forget that listeners have the power. Today, for example, I'm prepared. I thought of examples. I thought of stories. I've thought about what can I say or talk about that will be of value, that will be something that you can take away and use yourselves. But I can't make you listen. You get to choose, and listening is a choice that each person makes. We decide when to start listening, stop listening. And in fact, sometimes the stories or examples that I might have used have taken you on what I call a mental trip somewhere else. I hope you come back, but it might have gotten you to think or write down a particular story you want to tell or a lesson you want to give to someone else. In addition to that, each of us have preferences in how we listen to other people. Years ago, when I was at Tulane, I was working on some research to see how people listen differently. And from that, we developed a listener preference profile. And I want you to just think about these kind of preferences for a moment. Think about the people in your team or your sphere. Some of them like stories. They do. They want to hear personal kind of accounts. They may come in from a weekend or on a Zoom call, and they'll start talking about what happened last weekend or something like that. Others want you to get to the point really quickly. And that's why those 1-minute stories become so important. But it's got to have an action. It's got to have some meaning to it. Others like just data and statistics to go along with what's going on. So we've got to think about, who is our audience? What are they going to be interested in, or what's going to make a difference to them? And each person's different. And so we also have to think about the smorgasbord of being able to spread that out a little bit for our listeners. I'm going to reinforce this again, because this is the Joseph Campbell, that, listeners want storytellers who are prepared. They're prepared to tell the story. They're prepared. They're people they can respect. They also want storytellers that take risk. Maybe not like the risk in this image here, but they do want to do something different, and they want to follow their passions. And so we're seeing people today being frustrated with what we've had to experience in the last year, because they're not getting to do the things that they normally were able to do. And yet people also, the best storytellers are ones that bring something of value, something that people can use. So we want to go tell our stories, figure out how to do that. And we've got to listen to the stories of others, because as we tell stories, we connect with people. And it's a reciprocity that goes on. We are building relational currency too for the future. And one of the ways that we do that is by listening to people first. As we get to know people, then we have a better idea of what they might be interested in, or what might be important to them. So if we listen to them first and we encourage others to tell their story. So for example, when we just started with our community, we were meeting quarterly with our whole group of consultants. During COVID, though, we have met every month and done a number of different things. And in the first month, I think it was in April, I put up an image of whitewater rafting. And any of you that have been in whitewater rafting know that, and I love it, there are different classes of rapids. And so in the chat, you might even tell me after I tell you the different kinds. A class 1 rapid is pretty easy. You might bounce around just a little bit, but nothing that's going to be dangerous or cause you to capsize the boat or in any way. A class 6 rapid, however, is one that is non-navigable. And often, especially if you think about in Georgia, the Chattooga, you would pull your raft out and walk around it because it would be too dangerous. I asked people on a scale of 1 to 5, to put, and you could do this in the chat too, is to say, how are you handling COVID right now? Are you at, it's easy, number 1, or is it hard, all 6 here? And what they were surprised by is that because they see me as an optimist, can do, all that, I put a 3, that it was challenging, and there are a variety of reasons for that. So we want to tell a story and engage people. And as they told what class of rapid they were on, 1, 2, 3, 5, they told a story of why. And one woman said, in an hour, I can be in 3 different classes. And she talked about her children, one that was autistic, and different things that were going on. So we want to build the currency with people so that they'll also listen to us. So let's think about this for a minute and what we can do to make time to listen to other people's stories. We want to encourage stories, especially now with remote working. And I know we get Zoom fatigue. You may be feeling that even from the conference that we're experiencing today. Stories, though, connect us in ways that are remarkable. And those stories can be in so many different ways. And so, for example, one of the things we do with our coaching clients is we start at the beginning of it to ask them for 3 peak experiences, 3 stories really in their lives, experiences in their lives that have made a difference, that gave them a sense of satisfaction. Now you might say, well, they must be all positive. No, many of them were really difficult, but they got through it. They were prepared for that adventure. They took the risk. They followed their heart, and they achieved something and came out on the other side. So when we encourage those stories, we first want to build psychological safety. And, we hear a lot about that now. The best way with storytelling to create psychological safety for others is for you to be authentic in the story you tell yourself. I think about the leaders through the years. One of my favorite is during Katrina, one of my good friends, Rod West, was in charge of the utility in New Orleans, Entergy New Orleans. And he had to tell the truth about what he saw as he flew over New Orleans because people were waiting in Baton Rouge to come back and to help. And he was authentic. He actually cried with people because 80% of their homes were underwater. So those are the kinds of things that make it real, and people feel safer to open up and to express themselves. Of course, with stories too, we do have to think about boundaries, and some of it's time because of what we want to get done, maybe in a meeting. Sometimes it can be just team building. And I know a great story that often people get to tell and feel good about is who in their life has been a mentor to them, or who in their lives has had the greatest influence on the profession that they're in today. When we listen to other people's stories, it's also about being present. It's about listening without judgment. It's not there to criticize, but this is where empathy, to really understand where they're coming from and not to judge it at that time. If they ask for some feedback, then that may be different. But this is really just to hear what's going on in people's lives. And even if you don't express it to the other person, think about how it makes you feel. Remember that picture of the brain at the beginning of this presentation? When we get connected with another person, the brains light up similarly. And we want to relate to people in that way. Often we talk about irritating listening habits and what gets in the way of listening. And you could probably give me a bunch of them. And so even in the chat, if you would just write down some of the things that irritate you and others that are irritating, and that you feel like another person's not listening to you. What you have here are 2 of them that people list as a part of the top 5 irritating listening habits. One is interrupting. So when a person is telling their story, we don't need to interrupt and say, or ask for a detail. We don't need to interrupt and top a story, their story, with one of your own. those are two of the biggest irritating listening habits. And we go back to the old stories about someone going out fishing and saying how big their fish is. And well, that's nothing. Or if someone has a car accident, well, that's nothing. You should have seen what happened to me. And so we continue to top other people's stories rather than being present with them in the moment. There are ways to get the attention and to make stories stick. A book that came out a few years ago by Heath and Heath was made to stick. And I want to just show how this works in storytelling too, because you do want people to remember the stories. You want them to apply it. You want them to remember what the values are. For example, if that's the story you're telling about how we treat each other. I know one of our clients one time told a story about how someone was treated in a food line, and he stopped the food line in that moment and said, this is not the way we will treat each other, because someone had complained about the food that they were being given. So let's look quickly at two ways to do this. So you can make it simple, unexpected, and concrete at one time. That's what they did with the Mac Air. They gave specifications and they said, this is the lightest computer. But it wasn't until they showed it going into a manila envelope of how light or how thin it was that it made it real. So it was simple, it was unexpected, and it was concrete. I talked about New Orleans, and I'll talk about a hurricane because this then was a call for action and a story that was believable, that had an emotional appeal. People in New Orleans, and I lived there for a long time, didn't pay attention often to hurricane warnings because they would come and go. And of course, with Katrina, it wasn't just the hurricane, it was the levees breaking. But people finally listened when they saw pictures like this of how big the hurricane was. That's what scared them. And that's what made a difference when people told those stories of what could happen or what had happened in the past. So my last two messages here for you is that we want to encourage you to create your own book of stories. Who I am. In this picture, you see a woman with a child. That's part of what some of us are these days. And why I'm here. This woman as a police officer, why did she go into that? What was her story? We might want to know that, but everybody has a story. Well, what's my vision? What do I see? What have I created in my company or in my department or in my role is a vision of what's going to be different. And finally, what lessons have I learned? There are going to be a lot of lessons learned from what we've experienced. So I encourage you to begin to start collecting your stories, ones that you tell often and ones that make a difference. Finally, as a remembrance for us, storytelling is a key communicator asset. If you build that asset, you have more likelihood to be listened to and remembered. Stories enhance your effectiveness. They make it something that people want to learn from and about. And remember that listeners play a critical role during the storytelling process. We've all learned that storytelling is something that builds relationships. We all have stories worth telling. And I challenge you to tell those stories, engage your listeners, and become the leader that you seek. Thank you very much for being here today. And I'm now here to answer questions that you might have.